My name is Tori Thatcher, and I am 32 years old. For the first 27 years of my existence, I lived a life defined by a relentless, exhausting pursuit of something that most people are simply born with, a sense of belonging. The tragedy I have experienced isn't the kind that makes the evening news. It doesn't involve sudden, catastrophic loss, a terrible accident, or a financial ruin. Instead, it is the slow, agonizing, invisible tragedy of being the unloved child in your own family. It is the tragedy of spending decades bending, shrinking, and breaking yourself into pieces just to fit into a space that was never designed to hold you. I spent my entire youth and early adulthood desperately trying to earn a place at a table where the chairs were always magically full by the time I arrived. But this story isn't just about the quiet heartbreak of being rejected by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. It is about the most spectacular, unpredictable, and entirely beautiful twist of fate you could ever imagine. Before I tell you exactly how a devastating phone call led to me sitting alone in a Boston restaurant, and how the random strangers sitting at the table next to mine eventually ended up walking me down the aisle at my wedding, while my biological parents stood outside as uninvited spectators, I want to ask you a quick question. We are all connected by the stories we share, so let's connect right now. Where in the world are you watching this from, and what time is it there? Drop it in the comments below. I absolutely love knowing where my new friends are tuning in from as we embark on this wild journey together. Let me take you back to exactly 5 years ago, to the phone call that finally shattered the fragile illusion of my family. It was November 21st, exactly 3 days before Thanksgiving. I was standing in the middle of my tiny, cramped studio apartment in Boston, surrounded by half-packed duffel bags. I had a pumpkin spice candle burning on the counter, trying desperately to force myself into the holiday spirit. I had already purchased my non-refundable train ticket down to Connecticut to spend the holiday with my parents and my older sister, Victoria. Victoria was the undeniable golden child, a woman who could do no wrong in my parents' eyes, while I was perpetually cast as the difficult, overly sensitive afterthought. My phone buzzed on the counter, and I saw my mother's name flash across the screen. I smiled, answering it on the first ring, foolishly assuming she was calling to ask what time my train was arriving or to request that I pick up an extra pie from the bakery. Instead, she didn't even say hello. She just sighed, that heavy, burdened sigh she always used when dealing with me, and delivered the 7 words that completely altered the trajectory of my life. "Don't come home this year. Victoria doesn't want drama." I stood there frozen, the phone pressed tightly to my ear. I asked her what she meant, what I had done wrong, why I was suddenly being uninvited from our family Thanksgiving just 3 days before the holiday. She offered no explanation, no comfort, and absolutely no apology. She simply stated that Victoria was feeling stressed about her upcoming promotion and wanted a peaceful, intimate holiday, which apparently meant excluding me entirely. She told me to have a nice weekend in Boston and hung up before I could even formulate a response. The dial tone echoed in my ear, loud and absolute. I didn't scream or throw my phone against the wall. I just slowly sank down onto the floor of my apartment, leaning against my half-packed suitcase, and let the crushing reality wash over me. I had spent 27 years trying to earn their love, tiptoeing around their moods, buying thoughtful gifts, and biting my tongue when they made cruel jokes at my expense. And with a single 2-minute phone call, they had slammed the door completely shut. I was utterly alone, holding a non-refundable ticket to a home that didn't want me. The next 3 days passed in a miserable, suffocating blur of isolation, culminating in the single most painful Thursday of my entire life, where I found myself wandering the frigid streets of Boston on Thanksgiving Day with absolutely nowhere to go and no one to see. The city was agonizingly quiet, the usual bustling crowds replaced by an eerie stillness as everyone retreated into the warm, glowing sanctuaries of their homes to celebrate with the people who cherished them. I had spent the morning lying in bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, actively fighting the urge to check social media because I knew exactly what I would find. Perfectly curated, glossy photos of my parents and my sister sitting around a lavishly decorated dining table in Connecticut, smiling brightly, looking like the picture-perfect family, completely unbothered by my absence. By mid-afternoon, the silence in my tiny apartment became so heavy and oppressive that I felt like I was physically suffocating. I couldn't bear to sit alone with my thoughts any longer, so I forced myself to put on a heavy winter coat, wrapped a thick scarf around my neck, and walked out into the biting wind, determined to at least be around other human beings, even if they were strangers. I walked for nearly an hour, my hands shoved deep into my pockets, passing row after row of warmly lit residential windows, where I could see silhouettes of families gathering in kitchens, laughing, passing plates, and raising wine glasses in toasts. Every burst of muffled laughter that drifted out onto the sidewalk felt like a physical blow to my chest. Finally, desperate for warmth and human proximity, I stumbled upon a historic, upscale tavern downtown that had a sign outside advertising a traditional Thanksgiving prix-fixe menu. The host, a kind-eyed older man, gave me a look of deep, profound sympathy when I stepped up to the podium and quietly asked for a table for one. He led me to a small, dimly lit booth nestled in the back corner of the bustling dining room, a spot that offered a full view of the restaurant while keeping me relatively hidden in the shadows. The restaurant was packed with joyous, boisterous families. Large groups were crammed into oversized booths, grandparents were bouncing toddlers on their knees, and siblings were excitedly arguing over the last dinner roll. I sat there in my heavy sweater, staring down at the stark white tablecloth, listening to the symphony of connection happening all around me. When the waiter brought my plate, a beautiful, steaming pile of roasted turkey, stuffing, and cranberry sauce, I picked up my fork, but my throat was so tight with unshed tears that I couldn't manage to swallow a single bite. I felt incredibly pathetic, an unwanted outcast occupying space in a room full of people who belonged to each other. The sheer weight of my family's rejection crashed down on me all at once, stripping away the hardened, defensive shell I had spent decades building. I dropped my fork onto the plate with a quiet clatter, covered my face with my trembling hands, and allowed myself to do the one thing I had forbidden myself to do since my mother's phone call. I began to cry, silently but violently, the tears leaking through my fingers and dropping onto the pristine white tablecloth. I tried desperately to muffle my sobs, burying my face in my napkin, terrified of making a scene and ruining the holiday for the people around me. But the grief was a tidal wave that refused to be contained. I was 27 years old, completely untethered from the world, and entirely convinced that I was inherently unlovable, destined to spend every major milestone of my life sitting in the dark corners of crowded rooms, watching other people experience the love I was fundamentally denied. I felt invisible, erased, and utterly broken. I was so consumed by the heavy, suffocating wave of my own grief that I didn't even notice the couple sitting at the large, circular table adjacent to my secluded corner booth, until a soft, gentle hand lightly touched my shoulder, startling me so completely that I actually jumped in my seat. I quickly wiped my tear-stained face with the back of my sleeve, feeling a hot flush of deep embarrassment rush to my cheeks as I looked up to see a woman standing beside my table. She looked to be in her late 50s, with kind, crinkling eyes, silver-streaked hair pulled back into an elegant clasp, and an expression of such profound, unfiltered empathy that it instantly made my chest ache with an entirely new kind of emotion. Behind her, sitting at their table, was a man of roughly the same age, watching us with a gentle, reassuring smile, alongside two young adults who appeared to be their children. "I'm so sorry to intrude on your privacy, sweetheart," the woman said, her voice incredibly warm, carrying the soothing cadence of a mother who inherently knows exactly how to comfort a wounded child. "My name is Alina, and that is my husband, Thomas, and our children, Ben and Sarah. We couldn't help but notice that you're sitting here all by yourself on Thanksgiving, and you look like you're carrying a very heavy burden today. We have an empty chair at our table, and we have far too much food coming. We would be absolutely honored if you would consider joining us. Nobody should ever have to cry alone on a holiday." I stared at her, completely dumbfounded, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated kindness of her offer. My own flesh and blood had brutally cast me aside just 3 days prior, because my mere presence was considered drama. Yet this complete stranger, this woman who owed me absolutely nothing, was looking at me as if my sorrow actually mattered, as if my isolation was an unacceptable tragedy that she was determined to fix. I tried to politely decline, stammering out a weak, tearful excuse about not wanting to impose on their private family gathering, but Alina simply smiled, reached down, and gently grasped my trembling hand. "You aren't imposing," she insisted, her grip firm and profoundly comforting. "We believe that a table is only truly blessed when there is always room for one more. Please, come sit with us." Unable to fight against the magnetic pull of her warmth, I slowly picked up my glass of water and allowed her to guide me over to their brightly lit table. Thomas immediately stood up, pulled out a chair for me with a gracious smile, and introduced himself, shaking my hand warmly. Ben and Sarah greeted me with bright, genuine enthusiasm, immediately shifting their plates to make ample room for me in the center of their dynamic circle. For the next 3 hours, I sat in that historic Boston tavern and experienced a Thanksgiving unlike any I had ever known in my entire 27 years of existence. They didn't pry into my trauma or demand to know why I was crying. They simply folded me seamlessly into their vibrant, joyful dynamic. We talked about literature, terrible holiday movies, Thomas's disastrous attempts at amateur woodworking, and my passion for landscape architecture. They asked me questions about my life, my interests, and my dreams, and for the very first time, I realized what it felt like to speak and be truly, actively listened to without an underlying current of judgment or impatience. When the waiter brought dessert, Thomas raised his glass of wine and offered a toast, his eyes scanning the table before landing warmly on me. "To unexpected blessings, and to new friends who make our holidays brighter," he said, and the entire family clinked their glasses against mine. In that miraculous, transformative evening, sitting among people who had not known my name just hours before, the icy, hardened shell around my heart began to thaw. I realized that my biological family's inability to love me was not a reflection of my worth, but a reflection of their profound emotional limitations. The universe had miraculously intervened, sending these incredibly beautiful strangers to show me that genuine connection wasn't something you had to beg or perform for. It was something freely given by people with open hearts. By the time we finally paid the check and walked out onto the snowy, illuminated streets of Boston, Alina pulled a pen from her purse, wrote her phone number on a receipt, and pressed it into my palm. "Call me next week, Torre," she said, pulling me into a tight maternal hug that smelled of vanilla and roasting fires. "We have Sunday dinners at our house every week, and we expect you to be there." I walked back to my lonely apartment that night, no longer crying tears of grief, but weeping with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude, completely unaware that this beautiful, random act of kindness at a restaurant table was about to become the foundation of my entire future. The transition from being a lonely, isolated woman in a tiny Boston apartment to becoming a permanent, cherished fixture in Alina and Thomas's vibrant household did not happen overnight, but rather unfolded through a series of consistent, deliberate, and fiercely loving actions over the course of the next several months, fundamentally rewriting everything I believed about what a family was supposed to be. True to her word, Alina called me that following Wednesday, her voice bubbling with warmth as she casually demanded my presence at their upcoming Sunday dinner, refusing to accept any of my polite, deeply ingrained excuses about not wanting to be a burden. When I arrived at their beautiful, sprawling, slightly chaotic home in the suburbs that first Sunday, clutching a bottle of wine and completely terrified that their Thanksgiving kindness had just been a fleeting burst of holiday charity, I was instantly enveloped in an atmosphere of such profound, unconditional acceptance that it practically knocked the wind out of me. There were no tense, underlying currents of passive aggression, no cruel, biting jokes disguised as teasing, and absolutely no competition for attention. The toxic hallmarks that had defined every single interaction in my biological family's home. Instead, there was loud, raucous laughter echoing from the kitchen, the smell of roasting garlic and fresh bread, and an immediate, undeniable sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Over the next 2 years, I slowly stopped being just a guest and became a deeply integrated thread in the fabric of their daily lives, unlearning decades of emotional trauma through their steady, unyielding presence. When I came down with a severe, debilitating case of the flu that winter, expecting to suffer alone in the dark as I always had, Alina showed up at my apartment unannounced with Tupperware containers of homemade chicken soup, a stack of terrible tabloid magazines, and a fierce determination to nurse me back to health, sitting by my bed and placing a cool cloth on my forehead. A simple, maternal gesture I had never experienced in my entire life. When I finally landed a massive, highly competitive promotion at my landscape architecture firm, a milestone my own biological parents hadn't even bothered to acknowledge with a text message, Thomas insisted on taking the entire family out to a wildly expensive steakhouse to celebrate, raising his glass and telling me how incredibly proud he was of my hard work and brilliant talent, his eyes shining with a genuine, fatherly pride that brought me to absolute tears right there in the middle of the restaurant. They showed up for me in the small, mundane moments, too. Sarah, who was 3 years younger than me, quickly became the fiercely loyal sister I had always desperately craved, but never actually had, dragging me to midnight movie premieres, calling me for fashion advice, and fiercely defending me whenever my insecurities flared up. Ben treated me with the easy, comfortable camaraderie of a lifelong sibling, roping me into his disastrous DIY home improvement projects and never once making me feel like an outsider. I spent those years meticulously observing their dynamic, marveling at the way they navigated disagreements with respect and open communication, the way they freely and loudly expressed their love for one another, and the way they never, ever made anyone feel like their presence had to be constantly earned. I realized that my biological family had forced me to survive on mere scraps of conditional affection, conditioning me to believe I was starving because I was unworthy of a full meal, when in reality, they simply didn't have the capacity to feed anyone but themselves. Eleanor and Thomas provided a feast of emotional security, wrapping me in a safety net so secure and robust that I finally felt brave enough to completely block my biological parents and Victoria's numbers, officially cutting the toxic cords that had suffocated me for 27 years. I stopped waiting for the people who broke me to apologize, and instead, I poured all of my love, loyalty, and energy into the people who were actively putting me back together. Their home became my true north, my sanctuary, and my absolute salvation. I spent holidays, birthdays, quiet Tuesday evenings, and chaotic Saturday mornings nestled in their living room, surrounded by dogs, overflowing plates of food, and the intoxicating, beautiful reality of a family that had actively looked at a broken, weeping stranger in a restaurant and decided, with absolute certainty, to make her their own. The profound realization that I was no longer an orphan of conditional love, but a deeply rooted, irreplaceable member of this extraordinary family, was officially solidified during a quiet, unassuming Sunday dinner 3 years after that fateful Thanksgiving encounter, fundamentally changing my legal and emotional reality forever. We were all sitting around their massive, scarred oak dining table, the remnants of Eleanor's famous pot roast scattered across our plates, the room buzzing with the usual comfortable, overlapping conversations and warm laughter. I was in the middle of telling a story about a particularly difficult client at work when Thomas suddenly cleared his throat, setting his fork down and exchanging a deeply significant, emotional look with Eleanor. The subtle shift in the atmosphere made my heart skip a beat, a lingering reflex from my past where unexpected serious conversations usually meant I was about to be criticized, excluded, or punished. But when I looked at their faces, there was no anger or disappointment. There was only a fierce, overwhelming, and beautifully profound love. Elena reached across the table, gently covering my hand with hers, her eyes shining with unshed tears as Thomas pulled a thick, pristine manila folder from the side table and slid it across the wood until it rested directly in front of my plate. "Tori," Thomas began, his voice unusually thick with emotion, his gaze locked steadily on mine. "Over the past 3 years, you haven't just been a welcome guest in this house, and you haven't just been a wonderful friend to Ben and Sarah. You have become our daughter. You have brought so much light, so much brilliance, and so much beautiful love into our lives, and we cannot imagine our family without you in it." I stared at the folder, my hands trembling violently as a massive lump formed in my throat, completely unable to comprehend what was happening. "We know that blood doesn't make a family," Elena continued, her voice breaking slightly as a single tear escaped and rolled down her cheek. "Love makes a family. Showing up makes a family. Choosing each other every single day makes a family. We know that the people who were supposed to protect you failed you, and we cannot change the past, but we can absolutely secure the future." With shaking fingers, I slowly opened the thick folder. Inside, sitting crisp and undeniable on heavy legal paper, was a comprehensive set of legal documents. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was an official adult adoption petition, alongside completely revised estate planning documents, medical proxy forms, and emergency contact declarations. They had legally, financially, and permanently rewritten the entire structure of their family to officially include me as their child, granting me equal standing, equal protection, and equal love alongside Ben and Sarah. "We want to make it official, Tori," Thomas said softly, wiping his own eyes. "If you will have us, we want to formally adopt you. We want you to have our name, if you want it, but more importantly, we want you to have the absolute, unwavering legal and emotional certainty that you belong to us forever, and that nobody can ever take that away from you or tell you otherwise." I sat there, staring at the pages, the black ink blurring as a dam broke inside my chest, unleashing decades of pent-up longing, grief, and overwhelming, explosive joy. I looked at Ben and Sarah, who were both grinning widely, tears streaming down their faces, completely supportive and deeply eager to officially gain the sister they had already embraced in their hearts. I didn't need to think about it. I didn't need to consider the implications. I threw myself across the table, burying my face into Elena's shoulder, sobbing with a wild, unrestrained ferocity as Thomas wrapped his strong arms around both of us, holding me together exactly the way a father should. In that beautiful, chaotic, tear-soaked moment in the dining room, the 27-year-old ghost who had spent her entire life begging for scraps of affection officially ceased to exist. I signed the papers the very next week in a wood-paneled courtroom, surrounded by the fierce, protective cheers of my new siblings and the radiant, beaming pride of my parents. The judge banged his gavel, smiling warmly, and legally declared what my heart had already known for years. I was Tori Thatcher, the beloved, chosen, and permanent daughter of Elena and Thomas, deeply rooted in a family that had looked at my broken pieces and decided they were entirely worth keeping. The 5 years that followed that lonely Thanksgiving in the Boston Tavern were a profound, radical masterclass in unlearning the deep, toxic conditioning of my past and discovering the immense, quiet power of authentic, unconditional love. Healing is rarely a linear, cinematic montage. It is a messy, beautiful, exhausting process of rewiring your brain to stop expecting the people who love you to suddenly turn around and hurt you. In the beginning, the lingering shadows of my biological family's cruelty still haunted my instincts. If I accidentally spilled a glass of water on Elena's pristine rug, my entire body would instantly tense, bracing for the explosive screaming, the aggressive belittling, and the silent treatment that would have inevitably followed in my childhood home. Instead, Elena would simply laugh, toss me a towel, and joke about how the rug needed washing anyway, casually brushing off the mistake and leaving me stunned by the profound absence of punishment. When I went through a painful, messy breakup with a boyfriend who turned out to be entirely wrong for me, I instinctively tried to hide my heartbreak from the family, fully expecting to be mocked for my drama or told that I was simply being too sensitive, exactly as my biological mother and Victoria had always done. But Thomas didn't mock me. He showed up at my apartment with 2 large pizzas, sat on my sofa in complete silence for 3 hours while I cried, and then gently told me that I was a brilliant, beautiful woman who deserved a man who recognized her absolute worth, refusing to leave until he knew I felt safe and supported. These thousands of small, everyday moments systematically dismantled the walls I had built around my heart, proving over and over again that their love was not a performance, not a conditional transaction, and not a fragile thing that could be easily broken by my imperfections. I spent those 5 years deeply engaged in intensive therapy, finally processing the immense grief of realizing that I had spent 27 years desperately trying to earn affection from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I learned that my biological parents' rejection was not a reflection of my unlovability, but a profound reflection of their own brokenness, their narcissism, and their absolute inability to see beyond the superficial dynamics of a golden child and a scapegoat. Surrounded by the fiercely protective, unwavering love of Alina, Thomas, Ben, and Sarah, I flourished in ways I never thought possible. My career skyrocketed, fueled by the newfound confidence that came from knowing I had a rock-solid safety net waiting to catch me if I fell. I bought my own home, a beautiful little house with a sprawling garden that I poured my passion into, hosting my chosen family for wild, chaotic summer barbecues where the laughter echoed late into the night. Most importantly, I finally learned how to let myself be truly seen, dropping the armor of perfectionism and allowing myself to be vulnerable, messy, and authentically me. I completely stopped looking over my shoulder, waiting for the other shoe to drop, and stopped wondering when my new family would finally get tired of me. The trauma of my past, the agonizing phone call from my mother, the brutal isolation of that Thanksgiving, they didn't disappear completely, but they morphed into distant scars rather than open wounds. They became the harsh, dark background against which the bright, vibrant colors of my new life shone even more brilliantly. I realized that the universe had not punished me by removing my biological family. It had miraculously saved me, aggressively clearing out the toxic, suffocating weeds so that I could finally be transplanted into rich, nurturing soil where I was destined to beautifully, wildly bloom. The culmination of my incredible, hard-fought journey toward love, healing, and absolute redemption arrived exactly 5 years after that fateful Thanksgiving, unfolding on the most spectacularly beautiful, sun-drenched Saturday in late September, my wedding day. I was marrying James, a compassionate, brilliant, and fiercely loving man who understood every jagged piece of my past and actively loved me harder because of it. We had chosen a stunning, historic botanical garden for the ceremony, a sprawling sanctuary of ancient oaks, vibrant blooming dahlias, and winding cobblestone paths that perfectly reflected my passion as a landscape architect. As I stood in the bridal suite, adjusting the intricate lace of my gown, the room was filled not with the tense, anxiety-inducing chaos of my past, but with the warm, joyful, and completely supportive energy of my true family. Sarah, my sister and maid of honor, was fussing with my veil, weeping happy tears while simultaneously threatening to ruin her meticulously applied makeup. And Alina stood beside me, her hands resting gently on my shoulders, her eyes radiating an immense, overwhelming pride that made my heart swell until I thought it might burst. When it was finally time for the ceremony to begin, I didn't walk down the aisle alone, and I certainly didn't walk down the aisle clutching the arm of a man who had treated me like a burden my entire life. The grand wooden doors swung open. The soft, sweeping chords of a string quartet filled the golden afternoon air, and I stepped out onto the cobblestone path with Thomas firmly, proudly linking his arm through mine. As we walked together toward the altar, surrounded by the radiant faces of our closest friends and our massive, beautiful chosen family, I looked up at the man who had looked at a weeping stranger in a restaurant and decided to become her protector, her champion, and her father. He patted my hand, his eyes shining with profound emotion, and leaned in to whisper, "I have never been more proud of anyone in my entire life, my beautiful daughter." It was the ultimate, undeniable validation of my worth, a moment of such pure, unadulterated joy that it completely eclipsed any lingering shadows of my painful past. When we reached the altar, and the officiant warmly asked the traditional question, "Who gives this woman to be married to this man?" Thomas didn't just answer. He spoke with a loud, absolute, and fiercely possessive certainty that echoed across the quiet gardens. "Her mother and I do," he declared, his voice carrying the immense weight of our shared history, our chosen bond, and our unbreakable love. Eleanor, sitting in the front row reserved for the mother of the bride, beamed radiantly, clutching a tissue to her chest. It was a flawless, profoundly moving ceremony, completely devoid of the superficial drama and toxic performative nonsense that would have undoubtedly hijacked the day had my biological family been involved. It was a celebration of resilience, of the miraculous family I had built from the ashes of my rejection, and of the unyielding truth that love is not an obligation you are born into, but a fiercely beautiful choice you make every single day. As James and I finally exchanged our vows, sealing our promises with a kiss beneath the sprawling branches of a massive oak tree, the crowd erupted into joyous, thunderous applause, and I knew, with absolute, unwavering certainty, that I had finally, permanently, and spectacularly arrived exactly where I was always meant to belong. While the ceremony beneath the ancient oaks was a beautiful, flawless testament to the triumphant, loving life I had built, a stark, profound moment of absolute closure unfolded entirely on the periphery, completely unseen by the joyous crowd but deeply resonant in its poetic justice. I had purposefully and unapologetically not invited my biological parents or my sister Victoria to my wedding. They had lost the privilege of celebrating my joy the moment they deliberately abandoned me in my sorrow 5 years prior. I had not spoken a single word to them since that devastating phone call before Thanksgiving. I had changed my number, moved to a new home, and completely vanished from their toxic, narcissistic orbit. However, as Thomas and I were walking down the long, winding cobblestone path toward the altar, my eyes had briefly scanned the perimeter of the sprawling, public botanical gardens, and I saw them. Standing behind the intricate wrought iron gates that separated the private event space from the public walking trails, roughly 50 yards away, were my biological mother and father. They were dressed casually, clearly having sought out the location through public wedding registries or distant social media connections, attempting to lurk on the edges of a milestone they felt entitled to witness despite having done absolutely nothing to earn a place there. I didn't panic. I didn't feel a sudden, terrifying rush of anxiety, and I didn't feel the old, familiar urge to shrink myself to appease their judgment. Instead, I felt an incredibly profound, powerful, and icy wave of absolute peace. I held my head high, squeezed Thomas's arm tightly, and allowed them to watch. I forced them to stand entirely outside the iron gates, completely excluded from the warmth, the joy, and the profound love radiating from the ceremony. They were forced to watch, in real time, as I was given away by a man who loved me more fiercely in 5 years than they had in 27. They were forced to witness the officiant publicly, proudly introduce Eleanor and Thomas as the parents of the bride. They had to stand in the shadows and realize, with devastating clarity, that their absence had not ruined me. It had liberated me. They had smugly assumed that uninviting me from Thanksgiving would leave me begging at their door, desperate for their scraps of conditional love, convinced that I was too weak and invisible to ever survive without them. Instead, their cruelty had accidentally handed me the greatest gift of my entire life, the freedom to find my real family. They had to watch as the daughter they deemed too difficult, too sensitive, and entirely unworthy of their time, stood radiant and unconditionally loved, surrounded by an army of people who would move mountains to protect her. They realized, standing outside those gates, that they hadn't just lost control over their designated scapegoat. They had been completely, officially, and permanently replaced in every single way that actually mattered. They had successfully erased themselves from my narrative, and in doing so, they made room for a masterpiece. After the ceremony concluded and the guests moved toward the reception hall, I glanced back toward the wrought iron gates one final time. They were gone. They had quietly slinked away, retreating back into the cold, superficial lives they had built, carrying the heavy, undeniable knowledge that they had thrown away a daughter who went on to build a beautiful kingdom entirely without them. I turned my back to the gates, grabbed my husband's hand, and walked into the brightly lit reception hall, surrounded by the deafening cheers of my chosen family, leaving the ghosts of my past completely behind in the dust where they belonged. The real meaning of family. Torai's incredible, heartbreaking, and ultimately triumphant journey leaves us with a critical, immensely empowering truth that every single person needs to hear. Family is not defined by shared DNA, especially when the people who share your blood consistently treat you like a burden. Society often places an overwhelming, toxic pressure on us to relentlessly forgive, endure, and sacrifice our own mental health simply because someone is family. But true family is defined by the people who consistently show up. True family is the people who look at you when you are crying alone in a restaurant and refuse to let you suffer in isolation. True family is the people who open their homes, their hearts, and their legal documents to ensure you know, with absolute certainty, that you are permanently, undeniably theirs. If the people who were supposed to protect and cherish you have proven, over and over again, that you will always come last, you have the absolute, unwavering right to stop performing for their approval. You have the right to set ironclad boundaries, to walk away from tables where you are only invited to serve, and to build a brand new table of your own. Finding your chosen family is not an act of revenge, it is an act of profound self-love and survival. You deserve to be surrounded by people who celebrate your presence, not people who merely tolerate it. Speech balloon now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family dynamic to protect your own peace? Have you found your chosen family who loves you exactly as you are? Please drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and sharing your journey might be the exact validation someone else needs today to finally find their own strength and walk away from the people who hurt them. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another empowering true story. Until next time, remember, you are worthy of unconditional love, and you absolutely deserve to be chosen.